Hi, and thanks for joining today's workshop. I'm Sean Spivey, Chief of Staff and Senior Counsel for the FCC's Broadband Data Task Force. In case you haven't heard, the FCC has developed a new framework for collecting information on broadband service availability, which we call the Broadband Data Collection, or BDC. Born out of the Broadband Data Act, the BDC is a collection of location-level information on fixed broadband service availability throughout the country. A critical input to the BDC is the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, or the common data set of all locations in the United States where fixed broadband service can be installed, as determined by the Commission. By statute, the fabric must serve as the foundation upon which all fixed broadband availability data is reported and overlaid. The inaugural BDC filing period gathered broadband availability data as of June 30th, 2022, which was due to the Commission on September 1st. Now that this deadline has passed, FCC staff are working to review the availability data submitted by service providers, overlay that information onto the Fabric data set, and prepare maps and data files for public release in November. The broadband maps the FCC will create from these new data will play a critical role in the efforts of federal, state, and tribal governments to ensure that essential broadband services are made available throughout the United States and that broadband infrastructure funding is carefully targeted to the areas most in need. Moreover, and for the first time ever, the FCC will leverage the power of individuals, governmental entities, and other third parties to help validate the broadband availability data the agency collects. Earlier this month, on September 12th, the FCC began the first of its challenge processes, the Bulk Fabric Challenge process. The Bulk Fabric Challenge process is an opportunity for parties who currently have access to the fabric, such as ISPs and governmental entities, to submit challenges to multiple locations included or not included in the fabric. The results of this challenge process will help to refine the fabric data set for future filing rounds. During today's technical assistance workshop, we will provide guidance to entities who intend to file bulk fabric challenges on how to work with the fabric data set. We will also demonstrate possible approaches to identifying missing or misidentified locations in the fabric. We have reserved some time for questions after the presentations. Please email your questions to bdcwebinar@fcc.gov or utilize the Q&A function on the Zoom platform. We will do our best to answer as many of your questions as time allows. If we are unable to answer a specific question today, you may submit your question via the FCC's online BDC Help Center at www.fcc.gov/broadbanddata/help. You can find additional information and resources in the BDC Help Center, as well as a detailed user guide for the BDC system. The website will be regularly updated with additional resources and FAQs, and I would encourage you to visit the website often throughout this process. We appreciate you taking the time to participate in this workshop and hope that it will be helpful as you participate in the BDC Bulk Fabric Challenge process. And with that, let's start our first presentation. I'm going to now turn it over to John Emmett, a geospatial information specialist in the FCC's Office of Economics and Analytics, for the first presentation. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Sean. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining this workshop. I'm going to lead off by discussing what broadband serviceable location means in relation to the broadband data collection. As you probably know, the Broadband Data Act required the Commission to establish the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, a common data set of all locations in the United States where fixed, mass market broadband internet access service can be installed as determined by the Commission. The Broadband Data Act also provides that fabric shall serve as the foundation upon which all data relating to the availability of fixed broadband internet access service collected in the BDC shall be reported and overlaid. In keeping with the BDA statutory provisions, the Commission defined a broadband serviceable location, or BSL, as a business or residential location in the United States at which fixed broadband internet access service is or can be installed. Each BSL is reflected in the fabric as a single point defined by a set of geographic coordinates that fall within the footprint of a building, and each such location is assigned a unique location ID. Address information is associated with a BSL to the extent available. BSLs can be identified in the fabric as residential, business, or both. Per FCC decisions, residential BSLs are residential structures, including all structures that are or contain housing units or group quarters based on the U.S. Census Bureau definition of these terms. In the case of a single residential parcel with one single-family home, the structure of the single-family home is identified as one BSL on the fabric. Similarly, an individual townhome or row house that is on its own parcel is identified as one BSL on the fabric. In situations where there is one residential structure, but more than one housing unit on the parcel, such as a duplex or triplex, an apartment building, or a home with a basement apartment, the fabric identifies the structure as one BSL, but includes the number of separate housing units at the location in the unit count field to the extent such information is available. Multi-tenant environments, or MTEs, are similarly identified as a single BSL with an associated unit count in the fabric, unless multiple MTE structures are located on the same parcel, in which case each individual structure is identified as a separate BSL in the fabric. Business BSLs are non-residential structures that are on a property without residential locations and that would be expected to demand mass market broadband internet access service. Generally, the fabric reflects one representative BSL on a non-residential parcel when any of the following circumstances exist. 1, all of the structures on the parcel are commonly owned and or occupied by a single tenant. 2, there are multiple structures that the available data indicate would be expected to subscribe to mass market service. 3, the parcel contains multiple group quarter structures, such as dormitories, prison facilities, or nursing homes. Or 4, a recreational area such as an RV park or marina. For example, a single structure with multiple office units on a non-residential parcel is designated as a single BSL in the fabric. Finally, a note about mass market services. As discussed earlier, the broadband data collection is gathering information on the availability of mass market broadband internet service. Certain locations, such as community anchor institutions or high demand business locations, are not expected to receive mass market service. Instead, these locations likely rely upon enterprise-grade services not commercially available in the mass market. Accordingly, these locations are not generally within the scope of the availability data collection. The first version of the fabric data attempted to identify these non-mass market locations through a mix of prior commission precedent and some assumptions about the broadband needs of certain categories and sizes of businesses. As one example, the fabric assumes that local government buildings in jurisdictions with a population of at least 500,000 are more likely to rely upon enterprise or self-provisioned broadband service and not mass market services, and therefore are not identified as BSLs in the fabric. I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Steve, who will discuss in greater detail the process for challenging BSL and other data in the fabric.
Thanks, John. I'm going to talk a little bit about working with some fabric data to help generate a fabric challenge. First and foremost, the fabric is a geospatial data set. It comes in a simple file format with just text, but each data point has location information associated with it, the latitude and longitude. If you're trying to work with the fabric without understanding that geospatial component, it's very easy to make mistakes. We know working with the fabric is hard, but things that are quick and easy, like looking only at the text fields in the fabric data, runs a real risk of generating information and challenges that aren't likely to be upheld, and may be attempting to add locations that are already accounted for in the fabric. We don't want to see all of you spend your time and effort and potentially pay for consultants to do work that won't move the needle. I'm going to walk through a few examples of fabric points and data that we've received. If we can start the slides, please. Once I do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about different approaches that you can take. So I'm hoping that everybody can see the screen and for the examples that I'm going to walk through. So the first image here is a satellite view of a small neighborhood that an ISP said was missing locations. I took the fabric locations in the area and put them on a map in QGIS, an open source software package, and then put them on a satellite view to see if there are any locations missing. What I'm seeing here doesn't seem like there's a lot that's missing. There are single family homes and each one is identified with a fabric point on it. There are some secondary buildings like garages that are not indicated as having fabric locations on them, as we would expect. In fact, there may be some locations in here that shouldn't be BSLs. I looked at this area because the ISP said that we in the fabric were missing addresses that they have in their systems. But when I looked at the data in a bit of detail, I could see in some of these areas that the underlying source data had conflicting address information, and the ones we associated with the points that they were highlighting for us might not be what the ISP has in their records. In other words, the ISP's records may reflect the actual address. It will be very helpful to us to get that kind of input, to change the address for each of the locations where that's true. But if we try and add new BSLs in this area, they're either going to hit existing BSLs, hit the existing structures that are already included in the fabric, or not be clearly associated with any location. Neither of those will meet the FCC's definition of a BSL, and so it will be hard for us to actually add locations to the fabric. And having trouble, if we can advance the slide, please. Let me move to another example with some real challenge data. But I'm not going to call out the filer. In fact, you'll see here that I've obscured the road name, so you won't know exactly what areas we're looking at. I'm again using QGIS here, but this time with OpenStreetMap data that include building footprints in this area. Just a little bit easier to see what's going on. Again, you can see BSLs hitting all the building footprints, so it doesn't seem like we're missing any structures. The data that go into this map view, by the way, are available through an open source license, so readily accessible to anyone. Now I'll overlay the challenge data that we received. As you can see, the challenge points are clustered together, not particularly close to any buildings, and generally they're sitting directly on roads. I don't know exactly where this challenger's data came from, but this is pretty common with some geocoders, especially those that are low cost or free, though that's not to say that more expensive geocoders are always more reliable. These challenges don't meet the requirements for a BSL. The points aren't on structures. I suspect that this challenger has a bunch of addresses that it's not finding in the fabric. These could be added as secondary addresses or the associated existing BSLs. And if that is the case, I would encourage the challenger to file that kind of challenge instead. But that's just a guess on my part. What I can say with some degree of certainty is that the challenges to add a BSL don't meet the requirements for doing so. A third example here is a bit more complicated. For some reason, this area lacks a lot of existing building footprints on the OpenStreetMap data. There are more building footprints in Google and Bing and Esri maps, but let me just quickly show you a satellite view so you can see that some of the areas where we were lacking building structures actually do have buildings where we're showing fabric points. Now, when I overlay the challenge data, you can see the same issue with points on the roads in a couple of places. That's not the only places where this is an issue, but there's sort of a cluster that I've highlighted here. But there's some other more interesting data that go along with this challenge. Let me highlight two location points submitted by the challenger. One sits on a BSL footprint and the other is a tiny bit off the road. The address numbers submitted by the challenger are 220 and 240, which I think should both be on the south side of this road. The fabric points have addresses of 214 and 222. The challenges were submitted as a request to add a missing location. However, if these challenges have been submitted as a different type, to correct the address associated with the location or to add more addresses to the existing BSL points, we could have considered incorporating them into the fabric. Unfortunately, the way the challenge was submitted doesn't allow us to understand what the challenger is looking to do and to process their challenge data. One last location I want to highlight, that there's a point here in the middle of the block. Oops, sorry. That's what happens when you hit the wrong button on the mouse. Sorry about that. The challenges were submitted as a request to add a point that's in the middle of the block here. And if you look at the challenge data, the address number for this point is 219, but on the road to the south side of the block. There are three buildings that could possibly be this number 219. What we don't know is which of these buildings it should be. One of them, the one that I've highlighted with that big green dot, is in the fabric already, but it may be one of the other two buildings over there on the lower left. So it's possible that we do need to add a fabric location here. But by putting the data point in the parking lot in the middle of that block, rather than on a building, we lack the data we would need to add a BSL. The way the challenge was filed doesn't provide us with the data we need. One of those buildings is probably, well, I don't want to say probably, maybe that missing BSL, but we just don't have enough information. So there are a few different approaches to providing reliable data, and they depend a little bit on the amount of data that you have. If you have a small enough footprint, you can literally look at the various fabric location points on a map, similar to what I've done here. You probably have reliable on-the-ground knowledge of your areas of interest and can take the kinds of data I walked through here to identify what kind of challenges make sense and what data are appropriate. Second, if the number of locations you potentially want to review and challenge make moving through the data manually too difficult, you can look to automate that kind of process. We think that probably means having access to address data and a reliable way to find the precise locations of those addresses, and then data about the building footprints to make sure that the locations line up with real buildings. With those data sources, you can use the interactive tools in QGIS or scripted tools like Python or PostGIS to automate a process. But we still recommend looking at the output on a map to make sure it makes sense and to avoid some of the pitfalls I described. Finally, if your footprint is really large or you're worried about your ability to create and test a process quickly, consider partnering with an outside party, such as an academic institution, if you're a governmental entity, or a vendor, if you're an internet service provider, who can help reconcile the address data to locations. If collaborating with a partner, make sure that entity understands the kinds of requirements the FCC set forth. As we noted earlier, generic geocoders aren't likely to provide high-quality data in a lot of circumstances. Admittedly, looking at the data visually does require access to GIS software and some knowledge of how to use it. The good news is that because of the focus on getting the BDC data right, there are a number of resources that may be available to help. Local and county governments should talk to their state broadband offices to learn more about their plans for participation in the Fabric Challenge process and how you might be able to partner. Tribal governments should reach out to their local BIA offices to learn more about free GIS software licenses and training that they may have available. The FCC also has resources available, including videos and support available by visiting fcc.gov/broadbanddata/help. Now I'll turn it over to Chelsea.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chelsea Fallon, the Senior Implementation Officer with the FCC's Broadband Data Task Force. And building on what Steve said, I'm going to walk through the different types of Fabric challenges that can be submitted and when and how to use them. So if you look at the data specification for submitting bulk Fabric challenges, which is available on our website and which I encourage you to review, you'll see that every challenge record must include a category code with it. These codes run from 1 to 7, and each represents a different type of issue with the Fabric that you as a challenger may seek to correct. And then depending on which category code you use, you'll need to fill in other fields in your bulk upload file. I'm going to try. Okay, so all right, here's my first slide. So my first example of an issue that you may want to fix is that the address associated with a location in the Fabric is incorrect. So if you recognize that a particular location falls in the right place, but part of its address is incorrect, then you should enter a category 2 Fabric challenge and then fill out what you believe to be the correct information for that address. And one thing to note is even if you're just looking to change the street address, you'll also need to enter the state, the city, and the zip code field as well. And also make sure that the new address you enter doesn't match the primary address associated with another location that's already in the Fabric. If it does, you would also need to submit a challenge for that other location as well, and also using category code 2. The next example I'll cover is what to do if you find that the wrong structure on a property was identified as BSL in the fabric. So if the fabric point falls on a standalone garage or a shed rather than on the single family home on a property, you can submit a challenge to correct this, and then you would use category code 5. In this case, you'll need to enter the latitude and longitude of a point that falls on the structure that should be identified as the BSL. The new point must be at least 50 meters away from the current point, and it must be on the same parcel. Also, the maximum distance that the new point can be from the old point is 5,000 meters. You should not use this category code if you want to move a location point to a completely different place on a different parcel with a different address. This is meant to move a point from one structure to another on the same parcel. Okay, and then the next two examples focus on what to do if a location that is in the fabric data set but is not a BSL should be a BSL, or vice versa. So the fabric data set includes locations that are BSLs, meaning that they do or would be expected to subscribe to mass market broadband service. And those are marked with a BSL flag of true. The data set also includes locations that have or would be expected to have a broadband connection, but the broadband service would not be mass market. Those locations are marked with a BSL flag of false and are given a building type code of C for community anchor institution or CAI, or E for enterprise. So what should you do if you think these BSL flags or building type codes should be changed, or if a location should be removed from the fabric dataset altogether? So let's take a first example where a location is marked as a CAI or an enterprise building type code in the fabric, and then its BSL flag therefore is also false. But you know that the building occupant subscribes to or would likely subscribe to mass market broadband service. This could be, for example, a small city hall or a community center that was identified as a CAI, but should be reclassified because it takes mass markets broadband service. In this case, a bulk fabric challenger should enter category code 4 and then enter one of the building type codes that the fabric uses for BSLs. And these are R for residential, B for business, X for both residential and business, and G for group quarters. In the case of a small city hall or community center location, the filer should enter B. While B is labeled for business, we view it as encompassing all non-residential buildings that subscribe or would subscribe to mass market broadband service. Then on the flip side, in the next example, if a location is identified as a BSL and its BSL flag is true in the fabric, but you think that it shouldn't be, you should use a different code, and that would be category code 6. And in addition to entering the category code 6, filers would also need to choose one of the codes in the non-BSL flag field and enter that. There are 9 different codes to choose from, and these are listed out in the data specification in detail, so I won't read through them all here, but each one represents a reason why a location should not be considered a BSL. And these could capture cases where a location is a type of CAI that does not subscribe to mass market service. Location is a secondary structure and does not have electric power. The location is abandoned or no longer exists, or it otherwise does not meet the FCC's definition of a BSL. Then depending on which code is entered here, the location could either be removed from the Fabric data set entirely or be included in the next version as a BSL false flag and then a building type code of either C for CAI or E for enterprise. Then another type of challenge you may want to submit is to change the unit count associated with a location. This one is pretty straightforward. So if you believe that the number of units in an apartment building, for example, the number of units listed in the Fabric is incorrect, you can enter category code 3 for the challenge type and then enter the correct number of units in the unit count field. Then moving on to the last two types of Fabric challenge category codes. If you believe that a location is missing from the Fabric, then you would submit a category code 1 challenge. However, bulk challengers should consider all of the reasons why a location might be missing from the Fabric or why it might not be considered a BSL before submitting this type of challenge. Steve covered this in his presentation, and more information on this is available on our website, both in frequently asked questions as well as some video tutorials that walk through different techniques for matching addresses or service areas to the Fabric. But if you've considered all of these and still believe you have a location that is missing, you should enter code 1, then enter the building type code, the latitude and longitude, and the address of the location. If the location happens to be in a part of the country that does not generally have addresses, then the address fields can be left blank. However, we will be reviewing this information, and if we find that the location with no address falls in an area that does generally have addresses for its buildings, then the challenge may be rejected. Finally, each BSL in the Fabric has a primary address associated with it, as well as any additional addresses that may be associated with it, and those are in the secondary address field that comes with the Fabric. We recommend reviewing that file as well to ensure that any secondary addresses are correct for that location. And if you find that there are additional addresses associated with a location that were not included in the primary or the secondary Fabric files, you can submit a category code 7 challenge and add the supplemental addresses for that location. If I went too quickly or you missed something that I said, we are releasing a document today that lays out the different types of Fabric corrections and the codes and other information to enter in the bulk Fabric challenge data in order to submit those. And here is the link for more information and for help on the FCC's online BDC Help Center. And with that, I will hand it back over to Sean. Thank you.
Thanks, Chelsea and John and Steve for that presentation. We've had a number of questions come into the Q&A up to this point, but please continue to submit them. We're going to start out with a few questions we received prior to the start of the Q&A, but we'll get through those relatively quickly. So the first question I think I could take, is there a deadline for submitting bulk Fabric challenges? And the answer is no. We will accept challenges on a rolling basis, so there is no deadline for submitting bulk Fabric challenges. That said, the next version of the Fabric data will be made available to filers in advance of the opening of the next filing window, which is on December 31st of this year. So challenges that are not submitted in time to be incorporated into the next version of the Fabric will be evaluated for a future version of the Fabric. And we therefore encourage entities that plan to file bulk challenges to do so as soon as they're able to. Steve, a question for you. Who can certify bulk Fabric challenges? Do they need to be certified by a certified professional engineer?
A bulk Fabric challenge needs to be certified by a certifying official with a company, government, or organization. More information about that can be found on the entity information page of the BDC system. But bulk Fabric challenge submissions are not required to be certified by an engineer.
Thanks, Steve. Chelsea, are ISPs required to respond to a Fabric challenge?
No, so unlike the process for challenges for fixed availability data, which will be launching later this year, ISPs are not required to respond to Fabric challenges. So this is a voluntary process for everyone.
Thanks, Chelsea. John, a question about GIS software. I can't afford GIS software as some of it's fairly expensive to license. Do you have a recommendation on what I should do?
Sure. There are some open source tools that could be helpful. For example, QGIS, which Steve had mentioned during his part of the presentation, is a free tool that you can download for visualization and geospatial processing of the Fabric CSV files and other data sources. You can find more information on how to upload Fabric data into QGIS by watching a video tutorial that we've posted in our online help center, and we can post a link to that in the chat. If you prefer scripting or coding, then GeoPandas, a Python library, and PostGIS are other tools that can be used. PostGIS does not have visualization tools built in, but it connects to QGIS.
Great, thanks, John. Steve, hypothetical for you. How should I handle a structure where multiple units are in the same building, but they have different addresses? So for example, a condo building with 3 units, where each unit has a different physical address and is individually owned. Should I submit a challenge to add 2 BSLs in that scenario?
So that's a good question, and I think there's been a lot of confusion on this point. The commission defined a BSL as a structure, not an address or a service account. So if a building appears as a BSL in the Fabric, the unit count associated with that BSL is correct. In this example, the unit count should be 3. And all of the addresses associated with the structure are included in the active and secondary Fabric files, then that location is correctly reflected in the Fabric and there's no need for submitting a challenge. If the unit count is incorrectly reflected in the Fabric, then you can submit a category code 3 challenge to correct the unit count for that BSL. If not all the addresses associated with the location are included in the active or secondary Fabric files, then you can also submit a category code 7 challenge to add supplemental addresses for that location.
Great, thanks, Steve. Chelsea, this next question I'm gonna put to you, and I think it may be about data that is provided to in the Fabric data file. But so the question is, what do we do about all the locations incorrectly identified as ours? The only category I see as being a valid challenge category is category 6. The location is not broadband serviceable. Technically, it's not serviceable by us, but that doesn't mean it should just be removed from the maps. As far as I can tell, we just ignore them. Is that correct? This scenario seems to become an issue in a borough, maybe an Alaska borough that is very large, where the service provider only serves one community, but not other locations in the borough. Their current plan is just to ignore the locations in the community they don't serve. We won't match them, but we won't challenge them either. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that would be the right approach here. And just as some additional background on the way the fabric is made available to the ISPs and government entities who get access to it, it is made available on a county basis. So even if you are only interested in or only serve part of a county, you're going to get the data set from CostQuest for all of the locations in that county that no one's assuming that you necessarily serve them. So you can just focus in, can filter by the zip code or the census blocks within that county if you want to drill down further. But in that case, you wouldn't need to submit any challenges simply for that reason.
Thanks, Chelsea. So I may try and take the next two questions, and Steve and Chelsea and John can help keep me honest here. So the first one says in the BDC user manual, section 18.1.4, good job to the questioner for digging into the user manual. It outlines uploading challenge evidence. Can you provide some examples of acceptable challenge evidence? And does evidence have to be provided for each row of a change in a challenge file? So great questions. The type of evidence will depend on the category of the challenge submitted. So for example, showing that a BSL is missing from the fabric will require different evidence than a challenge showing that the location's unit count should be changed. At a minimum, we expect filers to submit a description of the basis for their proposed modifications to the data, and to include, to the extent possible, specific information such as documentation or images or results of analyses that will be helpful in understanding the reasons for the challenge. So for example, you could, if you have a relatively small data set, I think you could describe a process similar to what Steve was showing, that, you took data, put it into QGIS or some other software, did a manual review, and based on that are submitting challenges for missing locations, as one example. Separate evidence should be provided for each category of challenge, but a separate upload for each individual location challenged is not necessarily required. Only one evidence file can be uploaded with an individual bulk fabric challenge submission, but you can include different types of evidence in the same file, or file separate submissions for each category of challenge, each with its own evidence file. We received another question about how we determine whether address challenges should be submitted as bulk or individual. And this person says that they have about 36 or so total challenges in different categories. Is there an indication of whether a bulk challenge versus the individual challenge process should be used? And the answer is there's no threshold for a bulk fabric challenge from a systems perspective. The bulk functionality is available now. So if you have data ready and you are able to submit, we think it probably makes sense to submit it now rather than waiting until the individual mechanism becomes available when our maps go live in November. Also, depending on the number, if you have 36 or so, it may be easier to aggregate those into a tabular file that you can upload in the system versus clicking on individual fabric points for 36 or so different locations. But it's really up to you. Both processes are available. And I think we had a similar question, I have less than 50 challenges. What determines whether my challenge should be submitted in bulk or individually? Again, it's really up to you based on the evidence files that you have, the categories of challenges and the number. But again, the bulk process is available now. So we encourage you, if you have the data, to submit it sooner rather than later. John, the next question is probably for you. If an apartment complex on one large parcel contains 10 structures and each building has 4 units, would that be reflected in the fabric as 10 broadband serviceable locations, each with 4 housing units?
Yeah, that's exactly right. 10 BSLs, each with a unit count of 4.
Great, thanks, John. Chelsea, business office structures with multiple tenants. How is that counted in the fabric? Is it a single location with X number of units?
Yes, generally. So assuming the office building structure was one that we would expect to take the mass market broadband service, then, and it's one structure, then that would be generally be counted as one BSL, and then the unit count would reflect the number of individual units in that structure. Exactly.
Thanks, Chelsea. Steve, if a townhouse development with each unit on a separate parcel are shown in the fabric as one structure with multiple units in each structure, should that be changed to multiple BSLs?
So this is complicated a bit because condos are sort of multi-dwelling units, whether vertical or horizontal. And that's a little bit different from, say, townhouses or row houses, which are individual housing units, though they have walls that abut one another. So it depends a little bit on what the actual situation is, and it also depends a little bit on what the data tell us. So, for example, for a townhouse development, you might have what appears to be a single structure separated out into multiple parcels, and so those will show up as multiple BSLs. For a condo development where you've got sort of that shared or common ownership, what we will often see is a sort of parent parcel, which is subdivided into child parcels. So a bit of a combination, and I think the fabric reflects that. So townhouse development is a little bit ambiguous. If that really is a condo development, then I think it is at the structure level. If it is, completely separate ownership where somebody could tear down one in the middle of the block and put up something totally different, that would probably be more individual ownership. And so it is something we would want to split out. Admittedly, this gets to the quality of the underlying data that are maintained and made available. So it is possible that we've, treated in some instances something as one thing and it should be the other. But we really are trying to be consistent and not subdivide condos where it is that sort of shared community ownership.
Thanks, Steve. Chelsea, a question for you. The fabric assumes that community anchor institutions take enterprise and not mass market services, and therefore they should be excluded from as a BSL in the fabric. Is it a legitimate basis for a challenge to show that a particular community anchor institution does receive mass market service and should be included in the fabric?
Yes, so that if you have evidence that a building that has been tagged as a community anchor institution in the fabric does receive mass market broadband service, then you should enter 4 as the category code for that challenge, and then enter the building type code that should be associated with that building. In this case, I would imagine it would probably be B for business. As I mentioned earlier, that kind of encompasses non-residential structures that take mass market broadband.
Thanks, Chelsea. I think I can maybe answer this question and possibly the next one. So the first one is, will specific location IDs from the first production version of the fabric remain the same going forward? Will the location ID for a particular location from the production version of the fabric always remain the same? I think we may have addressed this previously, but the answer is that to the maximum extent possible, yes. One of the guiding principles of the fabric updating process is to try and keep location IDs tied to the same structure over time. That being said, that may not always be possible under certain limited circumstances, and ISP should use the version of the fabric provided for the relevant filing period. Another question for polygon filers, if their service area has isolated locations not reflected in the fabric, but within the contour of their polygon, would those locations nevertheless be immune from having a competitor funded to serve them on account of those locations falling within the polygon contours and thereby being serviced? So this kind of touches on funding decisions and those funding programs, whether it be the BEAD program that NTIA is working on, or future FCC universal service funding programs or other state funding programs, that the rules for those individual programs are determined by those entities and not something that we necessarily can opine on here. That said, to the extent an entity is relying upon availability data shown in our BDC maps, the location needs to be represented and the availability data reported on that location in order for an agency to know that service is provided there. Otherwise, you could run the risk of that location eventually being added to the fabric or becoming eligible for funding, but without your broadband service being documented for that location. The system does convert the polygon that you file if you're a fixed service provider into a list of locations. So just submitting a polygon in our system is not necessarily going to have your availability data associated for that location that is added in the future. But the guide, the lodestar being, be sure to check the rules for particular funding programs. Chelsea, the next question is for you. The commission not long ago released a public notice providing data specs for the provider data or the availability data challenge process. Is it safe to assume that that challenge process will not and cannot start until sometime after the maps are released in November? And also, with the fabric challenge process, do you expect the commission will release a public notice announcing when that availability data process will start?
Sure, so that is correct, that the fixed availability challenge process will not begin until the broadband maps are released, showing that availability data and making that data available for download. And we plan, when those maps are published, we do plan to launch the fixed availability challenge process at the same time. And there will be a way for individuals to submit challenges just directly on the map, or to do the bulk uploads, which is the data spec that we release for that. And yes, I think that we will release a public notice announcing that the maps have been released and that the challenge processes for availability data have commenced.
Thanks, Chelsea. Steve, a question for you. Does the fabric use USPS standardized address formats along with collecting the lat long?
That's right. The fabric uses USPS address standards, not NINA or some of the other address standards that are out there. And most of the addresses in the fabric have been CAS validated as being USPS deliverable. Thanks,
Steve. I think I can take this next question. Are tribal governments permitted to file challenges at this stage? Yes, bulk fabric challenges. That is the only challenge process that's currently open, but yes, we would very much encourage tribal governments who have access to the fabric data to review it, work with partners to review it, go through the steps that Steve identified in his presentation. But yes, to the extent there are locations that are either not identified or misidentified, we would encourage you to submit a bulk fabric challenge. Chelsea, how do I enter a correct address for a fabric location?
So when you are filling out the upload data file for bulk fabric challenge, you would enter 5 as the category code for this type of challenge to correct an address. And you would also need to fill out the address fields and put in what you believe the correct address for the location should be. So that is the street address, the city, the state, and the zip code, and the zip +4 if you have it.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. I'll try and answer the next question, though I'm not sure I fully understand it. Can carriers review the fabric filed by other carriers? To the extent the question is asking whether entities will have the benefit of challenges, successfully resolved challenges in the next version of the fabric, then yes, any updates to the next version of the fabric that are made as a result of the challenge process, including fabric challenges that are submitted by other service providers, that will be reflected in the next version of the fabric. But if the question is about availability data or other data, I'm not sure that I have enough context to answer it. So if I didn't answer your question, perhaps try reposting it in the Q&A, or this is probably a helpful plug once again for the submit a request feature on our BDC Help Center, where, if we don't get to your question today, as I mentioned at the top of the webinar, you can submit additional questions and we can provide an answer to offline. Steve, a question for you. Can a remote cabin, as an example, without commercial power be considered a BSL?
I almost forgot to unmute myself. It's an interesting question. So we lack a data set that tells us what locations have power. If anybody is aware of a national data set that has that information, let me know, please. And I'll note that even a remote cabin off the grid could have power generated locally through, say, solar or wind power. So it is certainly possible for a remote cabin to be a BSL. Having said that, you can challenge to remove a location as lacking power if that's appropriate, if there really is no connection to the outside world, and it is not something that should be considered broadband serviceable.
Thanks, Steve. Let's see. Chelsea, a question for you. If we can't use Category 5 a Category 5 challenge to move points that are placed on a wrong parcel, which category should we use? Do we need to remove these and then add them as a Category 1 challenge to add a new BSL?
Right. So yeah, that's a good question, and you're reminding me that I misspoke when I answered my previous question. Changing the address, correcting the address is a Category 2, not a Category 5. So apologies for that. But if you feel that the point it needs to be moved to a completely different place, not on the same parcel, then that would require sort of a two-step process. One, entering a Category 6 challenge to remove the location that you think is completely misplaced, and then a Category 1 to add the location in its new spot. So and again, I would recommend that you kind of consider all of the factors that kind of go into submitting a Category 1 challenge and reasons why a location could be seem like it's missing, but might actually be reflected in the fabric.
Thanks, Chelsea. Steve, a question for you. Is there a threshold structurally for residential developments that are in the process of development?
It's a good question, and it sort of came up in our earlier workshop, where we were excluding some areas that have been parceled and addressed but not yet built. I think the way to think about it is that it should not be a BSL until the structure is habitable. which I think aligns with things like census, that it's, if it's still under construction, if it's not something that somebody can move into, it's not yet a BSL. It may be, though, that some of our source data will lag when that happens. So there may be instances where you will need to do a challenge, but I think the target that we have is for the location to be actually something that someone could move into and request service at.
Thanks, Steve. Chelsea, can providers submit multiple bulk challenge files?
Yes, so each bulk challenge submission just has one file associated with it, but providers or other bulk challenge filers can submit multiple submissions. And the limit for one single file or submission would be 250,000 records. So if you could choose to submit multiple submissions with like different category code if you would like, or you could put it all into one large file as long as it's under the 250K limit for one submission.
Thanks, Chelsea. Okay, I see we have a few minutes left before the end of the hour. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Steve a question, then I'm going to try and cover one or two quick questions, and then I'm going to ask John, Steve, and Chelsea if there are any other questions that they see in the chat that they think we haven't gotten to, but should really try to before the end of the hour. So with that, let me start with Steve. Steve, a lot of locations are not assigned an E911 address until someone actually requests service. Can they be added without an address, or do we have to get an address assigned? This would include areas with typically seasonal type units.
So I'm not 100%. I understand the circumstance here. I will say the Fabric doesn't rely on E911 addresses. As I mentioned earlier, it uses the USPS address standards and validation, not E911. Typically, what we see is that local governments will assign addresses well before new locations are built, and in fact, too soon, as I just mentioned, to be considered a BSL. So we expect addresses to be available in areas that have USPS delivery, USPS addresses, even if there is not an E911 address associated with it. We do know that there are locations that truly lack USPS addresses, and there is an option for filing challenges in that circumstance. But I encourage people looking to file those kinds of challenges to be very careful and make sure that the area really does lack addresses, to make sure that that really is the right approach.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so we received a question about what happens if an ISP doesn't respond to a Fabric challenge. Does the challenge remain in limbo? No, even though the ISP does have the option to respond to a Fabric challenge because they will be made aware of it. If they don't respond, that does not cause the challenge to just hang in limbo. The challenge will be adjudicated by us. And then we received a question, are there tutorials on how to file a challenge? So in addition to this video today, we have made a number of resources available on our help center. We have demonstration videos that are available. We have the bulk Fabric challenge data specification document. We have the FAQ document and other resources that Chelsea mentioned were being posted today. So, we would encourage you to not only rewatch this video, which we will post in the future, but also make use of other resources that are available on our site. With that, why don't I start with John and see if he saw any questions that he thought we really needed to get to before the end of the session.
I did note a quick one of asking if there's a minimum record count for filing a bulk challenge, and there is not. As long as there is one correctly formatted record in the CSV that's uploaded, that is fine.
Great, thanks, John. Chelsea, any questions you saw that you think we should cover?
I did see there are some questions about the full Fabric data set being available and additional information about how it was generated. So the full Fabric data set as a download is currently being made available to ISPs and governmental entities under a licensing agreement. Once the broadband map is published, there will be certain information about the Fabric locations available, and there will be a visual of where those locations are. And for more information on how it was generated, in our last webinar, we did walk through, we had the CostQuest, the vendor working on generating the Fabric did walk through the process and the data sources used for that. And we do have a kind of a standalone video walking through that, and that is available on our website. And we are planning to make additional documentation available that will be detailing that.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. Steve, any final questions you saw that we should try and answer?
And we may have touched on this already, but one of the questions in here, will fixed availability data be released in the fall? They're not yet available now. That's right. So we will announce when the fixed availability data are available. I think you can be confident that we will have some real press about that, or try and get the word out. We're not going to sneak the availability data out. So for the time being, this is really just about the Fabric data and the Fabric bulk challenge process, with information on the availability data to come.
Thanks, Steve. And I'll try and pick up one more as I was scrolling through. The data sets that are mentioned during this webinar, mainly the Fabric data set, is only available to governmental entities and providers at this time. We do anticipate making Fabric data available more broadly to other organizations, but the Fabric data is subject to licensing agreements, and we do have to go through a process of negotiating or developing license agreements for each different category of user. We are in the process of basically working on the terms for other users, and we expect to provide information on that process in the future. But yes, it is true that currently the bulk Fabric challenge process is available to those who have access to the Fabric data, which are primarily governmental entities and internet service providers. So stay tuned for more information on that front. But again, in addition to the bulk Fabric challenge process, there will be an opportunity to submit individual challenges to Fabric data once the maps go live in November as well. So with that, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. And again, a reminder that you can find more information about the broadband data collection at fcc.gov/broadbanddata/help, where you can read knowledge-based articles, watch web tutorials, and submit a request for assistance if you can't find an answer to your question on that site. Thank you so much, and stay tuned as we continue to provide more information on this important project. Thanks.
Thanks.